Welcome everyone to the next of our Knowledge Now panels in the Faculty of Graduate Studies. This one focused on reducing inequalities, an urgent call for action. Now, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which I reside and live with thanks, and which York University has built its environment. Indeed, many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located, and which precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. The topic of conversation today relates to a challenge that York University issued to itself in its new academic plan, namely to make significant headway in contributing to the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 10 calls for reduced inequality, and several other SDGs clarify and relate to this goal by calling for instance, no poverty, zero hunger, gender equality, and peace, justice, and strong institutions. As these are phrased, therefore, the SDGs are directional, categorical rallying cries. As researchers, we provide the specifics through critique and education, creative problem solving, and socially responsible action. So to help us to do that today, we brought together three stellar minds from York University for a freewheeling conversation about inequality, inequity, how we can reduce them, and why. I mean, I'll be provocative. Why is this a necessity? After a brief introduction of our three panelists, each will then characterize what they see as the core of their research, or differently put, what are they driving at in their work? Then we enact Knowledge Now, which is to say, knowledge live. One of the joys of graduate school is that ideas get made when scholars shape talk into thinking together. So after about 45 minutes, somewhere around 4 o'clock, give or take, I'll open up the panel outward for questions from the audience. As we're talking, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The raised hand feature won't show to us, so leave it be. But written questions will allow Yuko Serrano, who is the manager of awards, FGS awards and scholarships, to group the questions into similar groups and pose them to us or to individuals here. Now, one of York's core values, a stated core value, is to advance social justice and equity. Each of the three researchers with us today, working in theater, education, and critical disability studies, is committed to dismantling the ideologies which promote progress through disadvantage and the systemic reproduction of inequality. So allow me to introduce, and I'll give short bios of our three panelists, and then I'm stopping talking. Let me introduce to start Mirko Nunez, who is in the graduate program in theater studies. Mirko is a Chilean-Canadian playwright, director, actor, and academic. She was the 2018 recipient of the Hamilton Arts Award for Established Theater Artist and was recently nominated for the Joanna Metcalf Performing Arts Prize. She's the 2021-22 playwright in residence at the Aluna Theatre, Toronto, and was a member of Natural Resources, which is Factory Theatre's playwrights unit for established writers in 2019. She was the playwright in residence at Aluna Theatre in 2016 and was McMaster University's first playwright in residence in 2018. She's the only Canadian workshop facilitator using the Fornes method to teach playwriting at theaters and universities across the country. She was the founding artistic director of the Alameda Theatre Company, a company dedicated to developing the new work of Latinx Canadian playwrights. She has an MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph and is currently obtaining her PhD in theater and performance studies at York University. Mirko was admitted to the PhD program with the Graduate Fellowship for Academic Distinction, which is one of the most prestigious York internal prizes. Next up, we have Mirko Stella. And I guess you should, Mirko is probably identifiable, but Murilo, Mirko, when I call your names, Cara, make yourself known. So Mirko Stella from the Graduate Program in Education. Of Italian descent, yet born in Lyon, France, Mirko Stella is an international PhD candidate in education at York University and a teaching assistant on the BEAR Borderless Higher Education for Refugees project, where he mentors Masters of Education students in the Dadaab refugee complex with the development of their major research projects. He earned a BA in Politics and African Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, England, UK, and a Master of Arts in Cooperation and Development Studies from Università di Roma in Italy. This program in Rome was the first interfaculty and interdisciplinary one of its kind in Italy, in Rome at the time. Now, his work and commitments have been heavily shaped by a childhood and youth characterized by multiple episodes of displacement and interruption, both linguistic and geographical. While still haunted by his early experiences with NGOs in Zambia, and yet determined to understand the origins of massive inequalities which characterize the world, he continues to engage with local and international NGOs, including UNICEF, as well as informal community centers on fundraising and educational initiatives. As an intern teacher in Brussels, where he prepared and taught grade 11 students a curriculum on development studies, he began to focus on the more decisive role played by knowledge in shaping the present and possible future worlds, as well as in developing public subjects and public spheres to bring such worlds into existence. His current doctoral research focuses on his experiences as an educator in the BEAR space and explores the potential for decolonizing and deconstructing epistemological and ontological and historical concepts, the antinomies of self and other, through the everyday practices of collaboration in education. Finally, there's Cara Goldberg from the Graduate Program in Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies, where she is a doctoral candidate in this program, exploring the creativity, tenacity, and allyship required to make spaces and places more accessible, especially to people with so-called invisible or episodic disabilities. Cara's interdisciplinary research focuses on how people navigate public and private settings where accommodations aren't or can't at all be built into the physical environment, into the infrastructure. Cara believes that fostering inclusivity for people with impairments not obvious to others, such as fluctuating pain and fatigue, calls for more than building up ramps and elevators. It requires us to have important conversations on intimate and institutional levels about what enables different people to arrive somewhere and feel welcomed. As an advocate, educator, and community engaged scholar, Cara has spoken to disability rights and justice-centered themes for diverse academic and non-academic audiences. For example, discussing the intersections of disability and Canadian law with sex educators at the Consent IRL series, and addressing challenges facing multiply marginalized LGBT plus youth at the Rainbow Faith and Freedom Conference. Outside academia, Cara has over 15 years of experience providing consulting services in strategic communication, editing and translation, capacity building and project management, as well as working as a holistic wellness practitioner. Both Cara's current doctoral studies and human rights prize-winning critical disability studies master's research, also conducted at York, were funded by Canada's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So, when I say stellar and impressive, I really mean it. These are exceptional individuals. Let me start with you, Murilo, and then we'll go to Marco, then Cara. So tell this audience, tell us about what in your work, what are you driving at in your research? What are you aiming for?
Well, I have over 25 years of professional experience in theater, both as an actor, playwright, and also as a director. And so when I arrived at York wanting to do my PhD, I really wanted the theater community in Canada to become accountable for the issues of racism that are ingrained into the fabric of what theater is in Canada. For a long time as an artistic director, I would have conversations with other artistic directors across Canada. And the conversation around race was always one that made people uncomfortable because nobody wanted to admit that there was a problem in our industry. But I look at myself 25 years ago when I graduated from theater school at Ryerson University in the acting program. I was one of 3 people of color in a classroom of 40. And so the amount of inner racism, external racism that was experienced was not something that I could make sense of at the time. I was very young and I didn't know anything about the industry. So when I got out into the professional world and I started to audition and work or try to work, a lot of the roles that I got sent out for were for very stereotypical Latino roles. So I was sent out as, for the hooker or the maid or I was never just seen as an actor. And so that really made me think about what is the perception that people have of me as a performer when I go out for auditions or I go out into the world. And because the theater world is very visual, we are watching the performers. When we audition, people are looking at what we look like, how small we are, how big we are, what color our hair is, how we will look against other actors. What you look like physically becomes a very big part of being a theater artist. And so one cannot ignore that people from different races are going to be looked at in very specific ways. And so there's issues of, when casting a show, a lot of companies, when people started saying, we need to fix the diversity problem in our industry, a lot of people started saying, okay, well, let's just pretend that there's no race. Let's just cast everybody as equal. And yet I think that is a fundamental problem in theater because it ignores who you are as an individual when you walk into that room to audition for that role. And so I'm looking at casting practices and my experience as an artistic director. I'm also looking at funding. Where does our funding come from? Where do, small theater companies that are specifically geared to a specific cultural group, why are we at the bottom of the hierarchy in funding? And then I'm looking at, institutional racism that exists on a national level. When we're in theater school, the canon that we work with, the literature that we're given is very, very specific, and it's not diverse. And it comes from a very Eurocentric model. And so right away, anybody who is of color has the cards kind of stacked against them as they enter the institution. And right away, you're made to feel like I'm not good enough. I'm a Latina, or I'm a Black actor, and I need to play a white character. So what does that say about me and my skin color, or who I am? What can I bring to this role? So those are the things that I came into the university with, and I realized it's such a big, big, big thing to tackle. So I've kind of honed it, and I'm going to look at it from the perspective of the playwright, the writer. What does the writer bring to the question of race when they're writing a play? And what does universality in a play mean now? I'm also looking at the work of Maria Irene Fornés, who was a Cuban-American playwright and director who created pedagogy around playwriting that kind of eschewed race and eschewed any cultural recognition for the privilege of being a writer. So just write what you know, write from where you are, write from who you are. And from that comes the truth of who you are. So yes, me being Latina will come out on the page. A Black writer will write who they are. Yes.
And I'm hoping, can we come back to that? Because
Sure.
It's a weird thing of both universality, but incredibly participatory.
Yes.
And so I have a feeling it's a good segue to Mirko, and then we're going to circle.
Sure.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Go ahead.
So good afternoon to everyone. So I wanted to start. I know that the question is what drives our research, and but I will answer that question by beginning with sort of an information piece. I don't know if, and this will help make the argument of what I'm trying to get at. And so I just indulge me for just a few minutes. So I don't know if many have heard, but in last week, on the 24th of March, Kenya, the government of Kenya made an announcement. The Ministry of the Interior in Kenya. The announcement was that the largest refugee complex in the world and in Africa, the Dadaab, which is located in the northeastern part of Kenya, on the border with Somalia, will be shut down. Or at least his ultimatum, he gave an ultimatum to the UNHCR, which is the governing body and institution which governs refugee affairs worldwide, that this complex needs to be shut down within the next 2 weeks. This is not the first attack on the camps. It's the second. It's many. There have been many preceding ones. So the ultimatum is 2 weeks. He says there will be no negotiations, and if nothing comes out of, if the UNHCR does not have a plan, doesn't draw up a plan to somehow manage the over 300,000 people that live in the Dadaab. So this is to give a dimension of the camps, right, of the complex. About 300,000 people live there, many children, women. They will use the military to drive people back into Somalia, or place them on the Somali border. I wanted to start with the story because it really gets to what I'm trying to do with my work in my PhD. And so I work within the field of education, obviously. So my real question is, what does education have to do with this? Well, all of this, in a sense. What does education do with all of this, right? With all of these realities that exist out there, these, again, massive inequalities that Tom mentioned in my introduction, and I wanted that word to be there because they are massive inequalities that exist out there. And so in a sense, all of my research is really about trying to understand what role can education play into addressing inequality, and obviously also reducing inequalities, but mostly recognizing and responding to these inequalities, but not just inequalities. And I'm borrowing from Melissa Orley here, who is perhaps, I don't know if Cara might be familiar, because I know that she works in women's studies, so I don't know if that's a familiar name, but Melissa Orley. And so how can education recognize and respond to the past and present, collective and individual, harms and wounds that suffuse our relationships with one another? So that is really what my research is getting at, trying to understand what kind of space and possibilities does the space that is crafted by specifically public education, what kind of space can it create that can serve the purpose of recognizing these inequalities and responding to them in a meaningful and significant way. And I've in the last few years, I've located my work within, as the introduction showed, within the project of BEAR, which is a borderless higher education for refugees project that is run out of the Faculty of Education in New York, and provides, initially was providing a B.Ed program, so a Bachelor of Education and training for teachers who work within the camps, the DAB complex, and is now actually moved further into education, the next step of the educational process, which is actually providing master's degrees to these students in the DAB complex. And I work alongside many of these students. I have the privilege and honor of engaging with them many times per week at 5 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning sometimes. And it's been a great process, and I wish to write about that, these experiences. What can education do, in a sense, to respond to all of this? And I'll leave it at there, I think, and then let Cara.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. I will want to know the findings of this because we all work in that industry, in that field of education, and have hopes for it. So Cara, please chime in. I mean, we have the bio, but what for you is really the core thing you want you want your research to be able to do?
Mute button. Thanks, Tom. Hey, Mariela and Mirko. In my research, I am aiming to identify and mobilize useful practices that are coming from different approaches to addressing disability issues, both on theoretical and also embodied levels. So in essence, I'm hoping to learn from the wisdom and expertise that can be gleaned from diverse lived experiences by talking to people who are navigating impairments and access barriers, as well as other intersections that aren't always obvious at first glance to other people. So I'll do a little bit of kind of disability background and then try to bring it back to what we're talking about today. So people with physical disabilities, as well as those who are neurodivergent or experience the kinds of distress and troubled or troubling behavior that often under kind of medical psychiatric paradigms get lumped together as mental illness. They face challenges not only because of their own individual differences, but also, and in some cases exclusively, because of social expectations and built environments that don't accommodate or expect people to arrive who don't have so-called non-normative minds or bodies. And I'm going to quote Beresford et al. Because they have a good definition here of the social model of disability, which emerged from the disabled people's movement. And the social model draws distinctions between individual impairments and a disabling society, understanding disability itself to be the problems created by barriers, discrimination, restrictions, and other negative social responses directed at people seen to have or identifying with impairments. For example, hostile and stigmatizing individual and institutional attitudes, inaccessible environments, transportation, culture, communication, etc. And thanks to the efforts of people who operate kind of from the social model, which says that, it's not so much about how we're individually different, or, to use the words that are dominant in sort of the hegemonic understandings of, dysfunction and pathology. The problem actually lies, disability is, society is disabling. So there has been progress in implementing disability human rights-based policies and legislation in all sorts of places, so workplaces, the public sector, etc. For example, those who are in Ontario might have heard of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which is already started coming into effect across the province. However, many people with disabilities have found that despite the lip service that gets played to inclusion and accessibility, on the ground uptake in public, institutional, and other settings can be really slow or insufficient. And often it's just ignored in practice. So in the principles of equity and inclusion that sort of we think are there, it's kind of similar to what Maria was saying about not wanting to talk about race and other stuff. It definitely can't extend in the same way. The protections don't apply in the same way in interpersonal or private relations, right? If your employer is discriminating against you, then there's procedures that, at least in theory, you can take to get redress. But realms that are equally important to people, in some cases more, like interpersonal interactions, often don't show the same progress, or it really depends on the social circle that you're in. As well, people with so-called invisible or episodic disabilities can often fly under the radar because people assume in many cases that disabilities are obvious and constant, indicated, for example, by a wheelchair or a white cane, or an obvious kind of physical marker. And judgments are frequently passed on those who are told they don't look disabled, but are seeking accommodations. So disabled people who can pass as non-disabled often choose to do so as much as possible, as much to avoid disability stigma, as because it's ingrained in us to not be a bother. So leading into today's panel, I was really considering how my research fits into the general theme of reducing inequalities. And I found myself thinking about intersectional disability justice frameworks and reflecting on the disability activist slogan, "Nothing about us." I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but I was thinking about this after we spoke the last time, Murillo, in our little discussion. The "Nothing about us" slogan demands something that seems to be simple, and that is that nothing should happen on behalf of a group of people whose perspectives aren't represented or who aren't adequately consulted or involved in the decision-making process. And while this particular slogan originated within disability activism, the principles it represents speak to accessibility, inclusion, and representation in ways that apply far more broadly. And I think both, to Murillo and Mirko's themes, it applies in, sustainable development, it applies in representation in the media and in theater and all those areas. So across movements and struggles, and also at the intersections between them. So I'm really coming into this conversation curious about how ideas taken up in disability studies and other interdisciplinary areas can come into, dialogue with the other ways that different scholars are conceptualizing and addressing inequality issues from different angles. And so I feel like that's where I'm going to end as we lead into the conversation.
Yeah, that's, as you were talking, I was hearing the connections to what Murillo and Mirko had just said. I mean, some very astonishing kind of parallels of rhetoric between race, ethnicity, nationality, and disability in those. A ton of things have come up for me. Maybe we can start this way. It's interesting because it didn't necessarily come up in the same way when we were talking in a previous session. The importance for all of you of lived experience and from drawing research from lived experience. Why? I mean, why isn't theory enough and you just apply it to practice and sort of press that onto other people? Each of you is talking about a different model that's sort of pulling theory and knowledge from a democratic engagement and interpersonal engagement through lived experience. Discuss. did that resonate with you? Anyone? You just come off mute and start talking.
Well, I think, it's lived experience that that kind of impacts every aspect of your humanity, yeah. Right? And so when I was a young theater artist coming out of theater school, and I felt physically the harm that was kind of put on me, but then I also, felt like I had a responsibility as I was getting, more into my profession, and I was becoming, a bigger thinker and more independent in how I approached my work. I felt a responsibility for the next generation, for the theater students who were not even in theater school yet, for the young kids who were Latino, who, didn't have anybody to look up to or any artists that they could connect with. And so I thought, I feel like it's my responsibility to do something about this. And so I started my company, thinking about the next generation, not even thinking about me, but thinking about how that would impact a young person coming out of high school, wanting to go into theater school, and knowing that at least one person, or now I know several people who are in the theater community who are trying to do the same kind of work, who are trying to change that reality for people, because it's such an interpersonal space. We are dealing with human emotion at every level in our performances, when we collaborate, when we create the work. It's all about how we communicate with one another and how that makes us feel at the end of the day. So if we can create a space that is that makes us all have an equal say and feel like we can be part of the dialogue, I think is the most important thing.
If you don't jump in, I will talk. So Mirko, come off mute. Cara, come off mute.
What Marilla was saying is fantastic, and I resonate with everything that she said. And I think there was one specific word that really got me thinking, and it was the responsibility. I think that word to me is crucial, and in the way I think about education and the way I think about my research.
I'm going to be the agent provocateur here, and it's like,
So in my work, I work a lot with Anna Arendt and her ideas, right, towards the world and what it means to take ownership of the world we live in a sense, right? So and take ownership, and I think of the future as well, the kinds of futures that we want to create. I think this resonates completely with what Marilla was saying, the future generations, right? How can we take ownership of what has been given to us? This idea of belatedness, this idea that we know we didn't create the world that we arrive in, but that we want to create a better one for the future generations. And I think knowledge without lived experience, knowledge without that sense of responsibility for a world, for a common world, is blind. And it has led, in the past, I think, in the idea of universalism, for example, a blind universalism. It has led down a slippery path, which oftentimes leads to marginalization. So in the absence of lived reality, in the absence of responsibility for who we are and who we are in the world, it's knowledge in itself is not going to take us anywhere. That's why, in a sense, that's why the pull of lived experience is so important. That's why I think what Marilla was saying, it humanizes us. That's the common line of humanity, even while offering a critique of universalism. There is a bottom line of humanity, and I think it is within lived experience.
Well, and materially, though, in Murillo's discipline, the more people who think and write and change, ultimately what we're talking about here is changing a canon, hopefully faster than slowly but surely. The canon of works in which students are educated becomes different. And that really resonated to me with what Cara was saying. If you understand disability as first a social mindset that is constructed in a society, a built environment, a way of a perspective, a way of looking at things constructed in a particular way, that's akin to a canon in the sense that this establishes the norm against which and in relation to which other people have to be assessed. And so, you know, from education on the one hand, Cara, how do you change well, I don't want to say, but maybe it still is, a dominant perception of disability that constructs disability and literally puts objects in the way of persons. How do you change that mindset, particularly when you're dealing with the invisible? Because I also want to get at that, you know, visible, invisible, identifying, not identifying.
All right, so I think to answer that, I'm going to come back around to the original question of the importance of lived experience. And I'm going to pick up on, I think Mirko said something to the effect of, you know, knowledge versus lived experience. And I'd like to reframe that a little bit and say that knowledge is lived experience is knowledge. And that if you take things out of their embodied format, then they're very theoretical and abstract. So if I take the areas that I've been thinking through a lot lately are kind of the critical mental health and critical disability models that come from different places. And I've been looking lately at, specifically, I just finished writing my comprehensive exam on critical mental health ideas and the models of madness or mental health that are put out there. And Ian Parker, someone who kind of puts the main models of madness as, you know, 4 of them come from psi disciplines. So that's psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, etc. And then you have the model that madness elaborates of itself. And the same, you know, a similar theme comes up in disability activism where, you know, the people who have been calling the shots for many years and framing things are not the same people that are affected by them. And so I think if you come from a place where lived experience is essential, then you can't have a situation where, you know, the people who are making the decisions are not the same as those who are being affected. And that applies especially when people are being marginalized. So, you know, there's a quote, I think, I don't remember, I think it might have been Hegarty who said, it's not the practice of people writing the DSM to allow people with a diagnosis to have any influence over it. I'm butchering that quote, but it's a paraphrase. But the idea is that the entire hegemonic framework that we have of mental illness is one, I had actually, this is the title of my comprehensive exam essay is, you know, it's a contrast to the quote that I started at the beginning. So nothing about us without us. I wrote, you know, all about you without you, no more. And so that was kind of what I took from that, was that, you know, the psi disciplines have an all about you without you attitude, where it's very much that specifically if you're someone who identifies as having, especially kind of what are considered to be more severe mental illnesses, you're especially not qualified to become an expert or a professional in those domains. And similar ideas have happened with the kinds of experiences that people with disabilities have had, you know, going to doctors who tell them that they should become more normalized in particular ways, instead of looking at social responses. So I would say that for me, there's definitely value in, you know, in collecting statistics and having a more macro framework on things. But unless you ask the people involved, you know, to participate, unless they're at very least equal agents, if not the producers of the knowledge, then what you end up with is, you know, a colonizing power over framework that replicates and intensifies marginalization.
Yeah, there was a lot of head nodding going on up there.
Can I just jump in again? Because what Cara's point, actually, thank you for clarifying that, Cara, because I did not mean that knowledge and lived experience are on a separate level. So I 100% agree with what you just said. And in fact, What I did want to point out before is that what was initially known, the canon, as Tom put it, right? This idea of canons of knowledge with a capital K, we're always built on lived experience. I agree. It's just whose lived experience that counts. And I think, Tom, you mentioned invisible. I mean, it was in a slightly different lens, in a different context, because you were speaking to Cara's points of invisible disabilities. But it's interesting to note how that lived experience was rendered neutral or invisible in the idea of normalizing. So, and was sold as universal, going back to Marilo's point, was sold as universal or normal rather than embodied and speaking from a specific position in the world. And I think thanks, Cara, for that for that bridge. But I think Marilo wants to.
Sorry, I want to bring in an example of what both of you are talking about. The idea of the invisible reality placed in a universal context. So Professor Loebel, you attended on Friday the graduate conference in which a performance happened. It was a world premiere of an ethnographic performance research, turning a short story written by a Roma woman and turning it into a devised performance piece to kind of understand the idea of other and to understand what the Roma experience could or should or is. And so in the chat, I placed a question to the group that presented the show, and I could see everybody really reacting in a negative and like surprised and didn't know how to answer. My question was, so the play that was created and performed and videotaped was performed by two white actresses. One of the characters is supposed to be a Roma person. And so I said, how can you really understand what other means when you have cast one of your characters to portray a Roma person, but has no lived experience of what that really means? You could do all the research in the world, but there's something cultural, something in your DNA, something in your blood memory that you would bring to the role that a white performer perhaps cannot. A lot of people don't agree with my idea about this, but I'm very vehement in that I was very upset because first of all, you're not giving voice to the story as it should be told from the perspective that you thought you wanted to give. Second, it also does not give the professional opportunity for that performer from a community that has been marginalized to perform, right? So once again, we are looking at white as universal, that white can play anything, that white is the default in all of our storytelling, in all of the stories we read, and in all of the performances we see. And that makes us invisible. That makes people of color invisible.
But how, can I ask though, and this will be an interesting question, I guess, in relation to disability, but how essentialist do we want to get? I mean, because there would be people who would say, blood memory? That's a fantasy. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
And yet it's not a fantasy. It's actually a very powerful metaphor for what, a piece of knowledge. But, others would argue,
I've had people
performance.
Exactly. I've had people say to me, but they are actors and they are performing. This is a performance. It's not real life. So what does it matter? It should be the best person for the role. The person who can perform it the best. I've had that argument time and time again. The problem though becomes that, people of color end up not doing, like I was part of a reading once. It was called the Refugee Hotel. And I tell this story all the time because it really did change my life. And it's a play about 8 Chilean refugees who arrive in Canada after the coup in Chile. I'm Chilean, so I understood that story on a visceral level. I auditioned for the play, and I was called in for a second audition. And the director of the play said, we're going to do a kind of, I'm thinking of, these are the actors that I want to cast for the play. So we're going to do a kind of like sample reading of the play. Can you come in to do that? And I'm like, of course. So I come in. Remember, there's 8 Chilean characters, and then there's 3 white characters in the play, so 12. And I walk in, and I'm the only Latinx person in the room. Everybody else was white. And I just couldn't understand, like, did the director not have access to actors of color? Like, could not Indigenous actors have been called in? Or why was it white? Why was white the default? And he cast me as the mute character, so I didn't have a word to say in the play. And I just couldn't believe that this was happening it was 2004 when this happened. And it made me feel invisible, and it made me feel not good enough to play a bigger role. And it made me feel for my community, are they not good enough to be in plays about their own stories? So, and this happens all the time, like Indigenous plays being played by white actors, Black plays, well, maybe not. That wouldn't happen today because that would be so political. And because my skin is not Black or brown, people think that it's just interchangeable. I can be played by anybody, but I can't play everybody. So it just becomes this really weird inequity.
Yeah, Cara, come off.
So I'm just going to kind of piggyback on that because, Tom, you'd asked about how this applies in disability. And I'm actually remembering watching a sketch by Maysoon Zaid, who's a Palestinian comedian who has cerebral palsy. And she's talking about how when she was, I think she was in acting school, when she was in university, finally they had a play that came out where the main character had cerebral palsy, where she's excited because she's like, I'm going to get this role. And then she finds out she didn't get the role. And she's like, how did I not get this role? Like, this is finally a role that was made for me. And they're like, oh, we didn't think you could do the stunts. And she's like, if I can't do them, the character can't do them. And so, like, it kind of reminds me of, I think there's a tension around this too, because then it's like, I fully agree with the principle that we should be having inclusion and people should be able to represent, but the question is the categories, right? Like, at what point do the categories, should only Chilean, people play Chilean characters? Like, can Chileans play any Latin American character? Or like, how far do you want to, should somebody with any kind of impairment or disability be able to play any disabled character? Because this is a huge issue. If we're talking about representation, you wouldn't, people barely bat an eyelash. People are still getting Oscars for portraying people with disabilities as able-bodied actors, right? And so the question is like, and this is kind of like a broader question about appropriation and, how do we resolve this is who, like, who defines the categories? Should any trans actors be able to play any trans actor? Or should, like, non-binary actors only play non-binary characters? Or how do we kind of set the best practices? And I realize in a world where it's pretty much, cis white able-bodied people who are getting all the roles, this might seem, with the exception of some tokens, like a far cry. But I do wonder that, right? Can any person of color who isn't Black play any other person of color? Is that okay? Obviously, there's some tricky stuff in there.
Well, and it really does call on, the importance of education, but what kind and through what mechanism? Because I still go to bed at night thinking that the Forneth method will solve everything, because
I think the same thing too.
but seriously, to get at the education.
Tell me anything about it. Tell me more about this message.
So I think what we're all working towards is a place where everybody can play anything. That's the argument I hear a lot from actors saying, well, anybody should be, if you're an actor and you're trained, you should be able to play whatever role you're given or you audition for. But we live in a world right now that is full of races and disability, and we don't know how to deal with all of those things and people and ideas. And so we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we equalize the playing field? And so I'm about education, just like Mirko says. I think education is the key to us moving towards a world where all of us are equal at the end of the day. And so for Nunez's method, when I went to do my MFA in creative writing and I learned how to write a play, they taught me the Aristotelian way of writing a play. So you have an inciting incident, a rising action, a climax, and then a denouement. And that's how most stories are told and written in the Western world. For Nunez, who didn't know how to write a play at all when she started, she kind of invented a way of like a found object or found word kind of way of writing. And she created a playwrights unit with at INTAR in New York City with a group of other Latinx playwrights in which the only way that they could write was in community. So their table, their desks had to be touching, and she would give prompts and everybody would write for 3 to 4 hours together. And it was about using sense memory, and it was about using, what your emotional memory, what you had inside of you. She would show a photograph, okay, write a play about this person. And you didn't have time to think. You didn't have time to plan your outline or to say, this is the inciting incident, this is the rising action. And at the end of the day, the plays had their own format and their own structure that were just as powerful as the ones that we read in theater school or in English classes. And so she kind of democratized the process and said, it doesn't matter if you know how to write plays or if you do know how to write plays, you're just going to use your own self to create the work.
But can I throw into that though? They were immensely, and they are immensely powerful, but they did change aesthetic presumptions.
Oh, yes.
Sure. Not just of how a play is constructed, but how an audience is going to react and be impacted by this play. Yeah. And that sort of changing the dominant structure of aesthetics is as much, is as much the political importance of this democratic collectivist engagement. And so again, I'm going like this because Mirko's up here on my screen and Cara's down here. It is immediately touching both of your disciplines. I mean, Mirko, you have to be resonating with this given what you do.
Well, absolutely. And there's two different directions in a sense that I sensed when I was listening to Marilo's point. And the first one, it has to do with this idea of the unexpected that I got from your point when you were, I forgot her name, Marilo. The author that you were, not the author, but the playwright that you
Fornés, Maria Fornés, yeah.
Fornés. So in Fornés, what I see is this possibility of the unexpected again, and I go back to my Arendtian framework in a sense, right? This idea of the possibility to do something that's not expected, that goes beyond conventional and the automatism of everyday life, right? So in a sense, that possibility to break, that possibility of freedom, right? Which is fleeting, which is a moment of fleeting, but then remains in this collective and common shared world. And in a sense, how can education cultivate that? That's the question that's animated my work as well, right? And I see it as, for example, how me as an educator, how can I preserve that possibility for the master students, for example, that are refugees in the DAP complex? How can I preserve that uniqueness, that singularity of those voices? And not only that, but for example, in their major research work, right? How can I preserve that uniqueness of that context, and how can it live alongside Aristotle, in a sense, in this, if we're thinking of this world of knowledge, right? In this larger world of knowledge that's shared and from which to which everyone has contributed, and from which everyone can still take, in a sense, in their own way, to continue to preserve this possibility for originality and for the future. So in a sense, so that's what I'm getting from it. Is, in a sense, how can we, in education, for example, how can we preserve that possibility for freedom and unexpectedness and that singularity? And in my work, from my modest sort of position in the world, what I'm trying, that is exactly what I'm trying to do with this, again, with the students, with the master students, is how do you, at the same time, develop a work, right? So in my case, it's how do you bring students to not to conform with the expectations, but how can you sort of change those expectations, for example, for an MRP, not just aesthetic here. Here we're talking obviously linguistic as well as aesthetic, but how can we actually change those standards? How can we change those standards, decolonize those standards, and so that in a way that those voices are not just invisible, but are actually heard as equals in the playing field of knowledge. And then that's the second thought. Tom, I saw that you're unmuted, but the second thought, the second direction I also thought about is, so that's the unexpected, this idea of renovation and renewal, of the world. But the second thought that I also had was this idea of collaboration, which is crucial. And I know that in the last 15 years or so, these practices of collaboration have been co-opted in top-bottom discourses, in a sense, in the idea of teams and the idea of many ways. I'm not gonna obviously it's a large discussion, but they've been co-opted in many ways. But this idea of collaboration, I think, is crucial, and that's one of the principles that I rescue and I try to use in education. So how can we use it productively? Last point, interestingly enough, the method I'm trying to develop to actually present my data is very much theatrical, in the sense that it's very, and so I find this connection interesting with theater, in a sense, Mario, going back to your point, because I think there is something about the aesthetics that I think, to Tom's point, there is something about aesthetics that not only needs to be decolonized, but also there's something about the aesthetics that can render more powerful a political thought. But it's in itself, it is political, and it can be radical. So, for example, I'm working with this idea of duetnography, right? This idea of an ethnography being multivocal rather than singular, right? So it's more people speaking at the same time and recounting a same experience from different perspectives, and seeing how lived experience colors that interaction and allows for all the asymmetries and the inequalities that we hold amongst each other, that join us, in a sense, how these emerge as well, right, in lived experience. So those were some of the thoughts that I
That's good. Well, because I'm noticing the clock, I do want to encourage the audience to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I see there are some questions that are forming. While you're thinking of that, and we'll open it up, I do want, Cara, I want to ask though, changing the way we think about things, collaborative, democratic, participatory, but at a certain point, doesn't power at a certain point have to come in and say, look, this has to happen? If we wait for a kind of democratic bubbling up, is that going to be sufficient or effective or fast enough to get people into positions of decision-making power, such that we don't end up always replicating this structure of, I'm making rules for a bunch of people that I won't know the effects of, I won't be able to feel the effects of those rules. I can only sort of project what might be. Doesn't there have to be some sort of rule that moves me out of this position? I'm trying to get you into where are you on the politics of this, the policy and politics?
So you're asking about a revolution, basically, and whether we need one.
Yes, where are you come the revolution, Cara?
I mean, honestly, I've been reading a lot of convincing people that say that we need one. On the other hand, revolutions, when they happen in practice, tend not to actually be super kind to a lot of people, including folks who have disabilities and mental health issues. That said, I think the current system is very much what you described. I think there's very much a power over, decision-making situation that is our default. And I think that respecting and listening to the multiplicity of voices, not everyone at the grassroots level is going to agree. Like, that's one of the things that has become really clear to me. The article that I quoted my definition of the social model of disability from was actually an article looking at whether it would be possible to apply that model to service users in the mental health system. And the conclusion that the authors came to was that although some users found it really useful as a framework or a way to, you thought it was possible to maybe kind of use the social model as a way to kind of make connections with across a broader disabled people's movement, so to speak. Most service users on the ground didn't feel like the social model was the model they wanted to adopt because they didn't want to identify as people with disabilities or as having an impairment and a host of other reasons. So I think it's really important for people who aren't connected to not be imposing all of these ideas, even if they seem really great. I think you need to have uptake from the ground. I think that's where education comes in, going back to the whole idea. But I think there also has to be room for difference and dissent and, diverse tactics and strategies to create these things. I don't think there's a model that will work for everyone, especially when you look at intersections, right? Like, if you're taking someone who is a single issue focused person who often is a person who might be, say, one step away from being male, cis, white, upper middle class, et cetera, you can focus on it that way, but there's communities that are involved that have different intersections. And I think there's no way to say this is the answer. I definitely think there are alternatives, on the mental health issue. I think there's a lot of proof and evidence in different formats from different places that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual has a lot of flaws and isn't necessarily a productive way for people to find, healing in a global sense. And it feeds into all sorts of kind of capitalist power structures. And there are people out there who are devising alternatives, like I was just at a colloquium with the Psychology Feminist Voices group on the power threat meaning framework, which comes out of Britain, where, it's really like looking at distress and difference with questions like, what happened to you and how did you react and how did you come to have the experiences you're having and how did they serve you? That's a really different series of questions that, if there was more education about it, that would be great. And we'd also have to do something. The people who are in positions of power now, who are benefiting from the status quo, are actively invested in things not changing and new frameworks not being adopted. So that's absolutely true. And so there needs to be mobilization. But the question is, are we just, to quote the very often quoted, I think it's Audre Lorde quote, like, the master's tools can't dismantle the master's house. It's a question of, if you just kind of come in as a monolithic person saying, okay, this is out, this is in, without doing adequate consultation and getting more democratic involvement, then at the end of the day, it may or may not be better. But if you're able to take the time to put things in place that not only serve the majority of people, the way we think about democracy, but take into account different perspectives and different standpoints and how things affect the people, within each group of marginalized people, there are people who are marginalized within that group. Yeah. And I think it's really important to kind of look at all of those intersections and to hear different voices. And those voices are going to be contradictory. And I think that's okay. It has to be okay at a certain level.
Yeah, I see your hand go up, and then let's take some questions from the audience. But Murilo, you went like this. I have to hear it.
Sorry, I just wanted to touch on what Cara was talking about. If we don't allow for dialogue to happen and education to occur, this is what creates kind of what we see now as cancel culture. You know, if you don't agree with what I'm saying, I'm going to shut you down and you're not going to be able to do what you do anymore. And I think that's where we get into a lot of trouble, because that's not how things are going to change, by shutting things down and by saying, like, there was a point in my life where maybe I was that person that said, no more Shakespeare, that's it, no more. But now I'm like, no, we need to have a dialogue with that Shakespeare, and a dialogue with the people who are producing the Shakespeare, to have them understand how that impacts other people and the future generations. And I think it's about having uncomfortable conversations, really uncomfortable conversations, where you don't have to agree with people, but at least we're in dialogue and people can take from that what they can in order for us to move forward. I don't think we will ever all agree on one thing that will make us a better world. We will always have different opinions. We will always have different politics. We will always have different agendas. And I think it's about education.
Yeah. I would throw in there, it's about education and also a kind of non-anxious relation to experimentation and play. It's like, you know, you're really worried the world will fall apart if you do this, or if so-and-so, you know, takes over. It's like, well, try it. See what happens. Yeah, Cara.
I'm feeling inspired by your encouragement towards incitement earlier, Tom, to sort of play devil's advocate for a moment here, though. And I'm thinking about something I was recently made aware of by someone who had to make a decision about how to spell the word women.
Oh, yeah.
You know, in a publication, and they had previously thought that women with an X was the most inclusive term to use. And then there was some backlash against that recently, and kind of looking at the origins of alternate spellings of the word woman, you know, which have gone back quite a while. So women with a Y, and then that became associated with sort of like a kind of a white liberal or radical feminist kind of separatism that was quite trans exclusionary, and the X was put in a way that might be analogous to the Latin X, but then it was called transphobic, and so there was one organization that put out a retraction of that and apologized. And then the question is, okay, if you're writing that you're having a women's event, how do you spell women? If this isn't a place for dialogue and multiplicity, it's what do you put on your poster? What do you put in your publication? When you have to make a decision of whether, you know, which of the people who chose to use this word spelled this particular way for different reasons do you err on? Because you don't have space in your poster for a disclaimer. You have room for 3 words. So when you say, you know, I'm hosting a women's event or a women's march, what does it mean if you spell woman with an A or with an X or with a Y or any other variety of words? So I think I understand kind of the original question, Tom, as one that, while I am all on this side of the camp of multiplicity and diversity, I do think that sometimes people are in position to make decisions and have to decide knowing that there's going to be fallout.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if there's any, I'm curious about Mirko and Marilla's perspectives on that, because I was a little bit stumped when I was proposed with that question about what this person asked my advice on what to do.
30-second answers, and then we'll open it up. What do you do? What do you do?
Well, I think you're always going to offend somebody. Somebody is going to be offended. So you can't cater to everybody. You have to be, I think you have to be proactive about your decision and stand behind what you've written. And if somebody's offended, that is their issue.
But
right?
What if it's somebody isn't just offended, they're misrepresented? Is the same sentence true? Well, somebody's always going to be misrepresented.
No, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know.
Let's leave it all to Mirko. He knows.
Well, I mean, can you just rephrase the question, Tom, just out of clarity? So
no, it's Cara's question.
is it Cara's question? I thought Cara was rewarding your question.
No, it's when you come to when you're in a position of power, and that's both good and scary, because your decision has consequences. How do you make, a decision where of what you're going to spell on the poster, knowing full well that every decision has some sort of consequence? Every decision, yes, may offend, but also may misrepresent. Or another way to phrase it is, to really up the ante, every decision you make is going to harm.
And this takes me back to again to my Arendt. I think that like not harming, and I think Mario was hinting to the response as well. I mean, there's every action that we take, whether or speech, any word that we utter, as always has the potential to harm someone, I think, in the world. And so, in a sense, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take it into account. It means the exact opposite, that we should be aware of we should have more historical consciousness, I think, more idea of how our words are harming people, as well as how our actions are affecting others. But it's not just, the problem is, I think the real issue is not just so much that it's our actions and speech, because the actions and speech we could potentially have control over, right? Because we can think through, they're thoughtful most of the times. I mean, not all the times, but most of the times they should be potentially thoughtful. The problem is, I think, and I think this is the question that you're getting at, is how our identities sometimes, and this is a question that I've been trying, to reflect on myself, and I've been using again Arendt, but I'm thinking of, so it's, the way I see it is there's a difference between what we are and who we are. So the what we are is, that's the belatedness, that's the aspect of that we inherit without actually having a choice in it. So that's me, for example. I mean, most of the ideas that have been put forward have been like, most of the accusations in a sense are towards people that look like me most of the times, right? White, male, heterosexual, able-bodied, etc. So I cannot help that part. That is already been decided before me, right? So in a sense, that's what I am. But what I can work on is who I am. And that's the element of subjectification, I think. That's the element that we can work on. So it's trying to figure out ways to be an ally, for example. I think Cara did position this really, really well when she spoke of the term ally. So it's thinking of how our identities, as well as especially when we are in power, and so our decisions ultimately affect more people. It's how can we become responsible, in a sense, for those decisions and for our actions towards others and the effects that these potential actions might have on others. So what I'm really saying is, again, education is crucial, but not just education in the sense of knowledge. And this is the point that I want to make. It's education. The way I see education is the potential for encounters, the potential for conversation and dialogue. And so as an educator, my concern is, how do I craft that space? How is it that I can craft a space where these encounters that will always happen within an asymmetry? Because difference, like Marilo and Cara already said, difference exists. It precedes us, in a sense, our own existence, right? They're already there. So how can we craft those spaces in a way that difference becomes a productive element almost? I don't like the word productive, but it can become a way to rethink our identities in the world, our social positions in the world. And so it can become an element to also act in the world in a way that's more responsible. And I mean, I can only speak for myself in this, but I mean, from my specific position, I found that one way to do this is to use my privilege, that little bit of privilege that I've been given, right? As again, in the academic setting, to try to work with others to provide a space for voice, but not just a space, but also the tools for those voices to be heard and be measured again on the same level as mine or those of others that have preceded me, in a sense, and are part of that body of knowledge that we often work with.
Speaking of the others, I'm trying to, I really want our audience to be able to engage. Yuko, do you have questions for us?
Yeah, so there are several questions, and they're interesting. They're all related to what you're talking about in terms of the power and in sort of changing. So I try to combine these two questions. So the question is around who determines which canon essentialist defined by, with reference to understanding personal and cultural context. And in terms of in being the setting of academia and doing research and education, how does, in this question, whiteness as default reinforces itself in academia, and how can that be challenged in methodology and research that you're working on? So I know there are a few components to it. I guess the panelists, you can address any part of that question.
In terms of any of you can sort of leap on it. I'm not answering these questions.
Well, can I answer? The way I think in theater to challenge whiteness as default is so at the educational level is to introduce works by writers of color into the education system. So instead of doing the the Shakespeare play, we're going to do a play by an Indigenous Canadian playwright. So that is one way to challenge the canon. Another way is for artistic directors in major institutions in Canada, like in theater institutions, to also begin to look at new play development. Let's have the next generation of writers create the work for us, rather than let's look back at the old canon of written by old dead white men. And start to, hire women of color to write the plays for our next season. So being proactive about creating relationships with writers, with actors of color, with directors of color, so that, you begin to diversify the environment.
Cara or Mirko, go.
Cara, go for it. If you want to go first, please.
Yeah, I was gonna just kind of riff on that and say that, I think this is a challenge to me because I work with a lot of stuff that isn't obvious. Mm-hmm. So I think there's something about obvious representation, but I think it's about really noticing. I won't necessarily say looking around and seeing, but noticing who's in the room. So whether that's you're writing a curriculum, and noticing who you're assigning. And I think this is also a question of identity, because not everyone obviously represents whatever groups they do. So for example, if you're talking about looking around the room, you can see, for example, people who are obviously racialized, but you might not see people who pass as white, or you might see people who look like they're able-bodied, or notice people who don't look like they're able-bodied, but not know kind of different disability experiences that people might be having through chronic illness or episodic disabilities that may or may not be obvious in a given moment. Someone might use a cane one day and not the next. Mm-hmm. But I think it's really about noticing who's there and also noticing their perspectives. I also think there's an element of tokenization that can be really problematic. And this is one of those areas that I don't have a good solution to propose. Because on the one hand, saying, oh, it looks like I've only got, white writers or white, speakers or what have you, I'm going to call the BIPOC person I know and ask if they'll show up, is also really problematic. So I think it has to happen on a lot of different levels, because tokenization is also a problem. And, when you're seeing what shows up by default, I think shifting that takes a lot more intentionality if you want to do it in a really grounded way. I think it's a chicken and an egg scenario, where if the people who are already in the room are primarily from dominant groups, then to get other people in the room might feel like a really big challenge to have it happen in a way that isn't tokenistic. And I think it's also sometimes looking at the reasons people might not be there. What are the exclusions? So if you think about the idea of universal design, if you think about that from a building perspective, you think, okay, you need to have ramps so people in wheelchairs can show up. But if you think about it on the level that a lot of people with disabilities experience poverty at higher levels, or need a lot more resources to dedicate to just managing disability, then so what if you can get in the room, but you can't pay the price of admission when you get to the ticket booth because you don't have access to financing? So I think it's really about looking at access beyond disability in all sorts of different ways, and looking at representation in ways that goes beneath the surface of like, oh, hey, you have brown skin or you're in a wheelchair, so therefore you're going to represent this group, because there are a lot of people who don't represent the groups that they, you know, superficially look like super well. And so I think it's both, it's a matter of, you know, style and content. I don't think I phrased that very well, but just, I think there's a lot more factors than just looking at, you know, skin color or the disability status or what have you of the people on your list, but looking at what approaches that they're bringing forward. Are they actually representing communities or larger collectivities than themselves, or not? And how do they do that? Are they claiming to do that, or are they quoting other people? Like, I think there's so much more that goes on. And on a superficial level, I think it's also important to say, look at your syllabus and see if you only have white authors, and then ask yourself why.
Yeah, sure.
Can I add anything, or do you want?
Yeah.
Just to the question of what I think Cara was. I mean, Cara mentioned a lot of aspects, and I mean, I don't have an answer either to that problem that emerges when you have tokenism, like you were saying, Cara, like this idea of representation, really, because it is. I mean, I think we are getting to the point that we're thinking about like some of the issues with like the politics of representation in general, right? Like there's something there, like, and that I think I was hinting at before too. Like there's something about what we are, but we always miss the point of who we are as well in this element. But going back to the question of whiteness, I mean, to me working in education, I mean, it's a question of standards. It's a question of decolonizing those standards and thinking about the ways in which they continue to exclude. For example, speaking from also like kind of merging within disabilities as well, right? And thinking about disabilities, I'm all for accommodations, but the issue becomes like when is the problem? When do we start problematizing the standard rather than the accommodation? Because to me, the problem with creating new bubbles or new canons around, and this is like accommodation can be thought of another canon in a sense in the university versus another center in a sense versus standard. But are we continuously recreating and reproducing the power of that standard in a sense? So are we actually rethinking the standard? And this goes to whiteness as well. If we keep thinking about,
oh, I see.
If we keep creating other centers in a sense, right, on the side of this untackled and unproblematized white center, like where does that take us? Does that take us towards just again a plurality, which is again, what kind of public is it? Is a plurality founded on just the continuous thought of neutrality of the whiteness? Like this is, so in a sense, I'm using Stuart Hall to think about like cultural, right? So there's a whiteness in everything. There's a white world, Fanon would say. There's a white world between us. And that was birthed from colonialism. And the institutions that we work in work with those standards, uphold these standards continuously in producing accommodations, just to give one example, but that's not the only example, in producing access programs, which are supposed to be thought of as minor or not at the same level as. So the problem to me as an educator is how can we actually take a step further and think of how is it the standards that are problematic in the first place? Because the problem is we do need standards if we're thinking about a public, if we're working towards a single public, but those standards have to be rethought. So I'm thinking here of standards for language. I'm thinking here of standards in our case, in my specific case, it's become standards of English. Who's English? Which English is the plural, for example? It's a question of what do we mean by quality? Are we still thinking it the same way about quality over the years, or should it change? I think it should change. We should go back to what we mean by quality in academics, right? So it's to me, it's a question. That's why I'm saying standards. And this, in my work with students in the DAB, it emerges constantly, right? How do I, as an educator, how do I grade, assess a paper, right? Which is obviously, and how do I sort of push for quality at the same time as recognizing this idea of accommodation at the same time, right? So this idea of difference or asymmetry in a sense in between students. So, and I think it's how we interpret those standards and when do we start rethinking those standards, or decolonizing, if you want to use that word. But I always fear that word a little bit because I feel it becomes a metaphor sometimes and not an actual concrete action. But I'll stop there.
Well, and Cara, you got physical, so you have to speak.
Okay, well, Mirko, as you're talking about standards, I'm thinking about values. If you think about it as values rather than standards, or maybe alongside. But the question is, there's lots of ways. For example, you can change a classroom setting to make it more accessible to everybody. So rather than offering special accommodations for people who, show up with a letter, who have been able to fight through the red tape required to get an official accessibility accommodation letter. I've been in classes where the professor says at the beginning of the year, if anyone needs an extension, just talk to me and you can have one. And that gets rid of everything. So it equalizes the people who have been able to navigate the medical system and those who have childcare obligations, to those who are going through crises, to people who are neurodivergent. And there's ways to do that, but there's a lot of labor that goes into being able to provide more universal accessibility. So what that means is that professor was taking on extra labor of being willing to mark on a sliding scale timeline, so to speak, and all sorts of other stuff. So if we decide as a culture that we value accessibility and we're actually paying attention to what that means, then we'll put our money where our mouth is. And I think the issue is so often that it would be very easy to make situations. I remember my first disability studies instructor was Susan Wendell, and she used to carry a wheeled cart with her through the hallways of Simon Fraser University, and talked about there was times when she couldn't use the ramp because all these apparently able-bodied people were flooding the ramp, because able-bodied people prefer ramps too. So if you build ramps, it's not just to give access to people who use wheelchairs, but to people who use pulley carts, but also people like ramps. On the flip side, are some situations where there are competing access needs. So some people might have visual impairments and need really bright lights that trigger other people's migraines. And I think that's kind of some of the more nuanced stuff that we also need to consider. But there are just some things that are better for everybody. In my master's classroom in critical disability studies, we had these really comfortable chairs that they had to go out of their way to get some accessibility services, and they were very expensive. And there was only like 6 of these chairs in the classroom. And so there was various people who needed them, and there was this weird kind of jostling game for who got them. But what if everyone could have an accessible chair, or a more accessible chair that was comfortable for different kinds of bodies, be they bigger bodies or bodies with medically sanctioned impairments, or, just people who have spent a lot of time because they're working 3 jobs on their feet and really need to sit down and be comfortable. Right. And so I think there's some of this stuff that can be universal if we put resources behind them, but that's usually where it comes in. People are usually happy to pay lip service to doing this stuff as long as it doesn't cost anything. But I think that really when it comes down to it, it's often about the fiscal bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, relative to another bottom line, because it's 4:35, this panel ended. However, before ending, I do want to connect, though, what Cara was talking about in terms of universality, another way of thinking about the multiple benefits and functions and stakeholders in a different understanding of universal. We come from a culture in which the same white Western has deployed universal as a power technique. Cara is talking about a very different kind of universal. Similarly, Mirko, when you're talking about standards, I could immediately feel a certain kind of audience member going, you can't change the standards. That always means lowering them. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about differentiating the standards in a way that I heard similar to the kind of differentiating of aesthetics that would happen if you allow different writers to write, to actually write out of their bodies and not in or under a form, which is a standard aesthetic white form that, in that aesthetic says is universally human. Well, it isn't. That's my gloss to bring us to a close, because I could just keep going and going. You guys were fabulous. Like, can we just stay here so that we can continue talking and seeing each other? I do, however, I want to thank you. I want to thank our participants, Murilo Nunez, Mirko Stella, Cara Goldberg. I want to thank very much the production team, Yuko Serrano, and I think there was Eileen and Anessa in the background somewhere supporting this. And thanks very much to the audience. I feel a little bit sheepish that we didn't get a lot of questions to be able to answer a lot of these questions. So what I'm hoping is we'll do another one. Let's hope. Thank you very, very much, everyone.